This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Romas with you. Today we have an extra special guest on here to talk about journalism. And we're going to dive into things such as truth in reporting and the damage of labels. For that, I have Professor Peter Klein from the University of British Columbia with me. Professor Klein is an Emmy award-winning journalist and full professor at the School of Journalism, Writing, and Media. He's a founder of the UBC Global Reporting Center, and he is a faculty associate at the UBC School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Professor Klein has been the producer at the CBS News program 60 Minutes and investigative producer at ABC News' Law and Justice Unit. So welcome, Professor Klein.
Thank you.
And I'll just let people know you have a Wikipedia page, so they can go look up your whole history. You've been all over the world. You've done a million things. I can't do you any justice in a short bio, but I want to say thanks for being here today. The topic of journalism and reporting is always kind of touches on law enforcement security. So that's why I'm glad to get you in here, because there's nobody better to talk to, I would say. So I just want to start though by talking about you and what got you into journalism? So why this as a career path?
I mean, I wish I could give you like a highfalutin, I was all about truth and justice and the American way and or the Canadian or whatever. But I grew up in the States. My parents were refugees from Hungary. They had fled communist Hungary, and so I grew up with sort of a somewhat skeptical view of the world. My parents went through lots of challenges. My father was actually born in 1909 in the Habsburg Empire. So he went through the First World War and the Second World War and then the Hungarian Revolution. So I've always been interested in what's going on in the world, and journalism just seemed like an interesting way to see the world, to kind of study what's going on. I mean, obviously, one could be an academic as well and research all sorts of things. But this seemed like I kind of stumbled into it, to be honest. I was a math teacher.
Oh, wow.
In Florida. And I realized I didn't want to be doing that at that point in my life. And I went to the local National Public Radio station in Miami and really just completely, naive. I was like, look, I'm a teacher. I'm pretty much done at 3. And I love radio. Like radio was and still is my favorite medium. And I was like, I just want to learn radio, and I'm happy to volunteer or whatever. And life is 90% timing and luck, right? I had no background in radio or journalism or anything. I was a math teacher. I was like, what did I know? But the station manager who had met me said, listen, I'm running this entire station, and in addition, I have to do a 4-hour radio documentary series on water in the Everglades. Do you know anything about that? And I said, well, actually, I was during high school. I was a state park ranger in one of the aspects, one area, sort of on the edge of the Everglades. And he was like, "Great, you got it, the job." I was like, "Oh, okay." He's like, I'm not going to pay you, but I'll teach you how to edit. And this is like this is in 1991. These are the days of like reel to reel. And, he's like, I'll teach you how to cut tape and you'll go out on interviews with me. And the first interview I did was with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who is somewhat known to people that name now, because that's the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas high school is where that, the horrific shooting happened in Florida. But Marjorie Stoneman Douglas is like a legendary figure in Florida. An early environmental activist who helped save the Everglades. And I was shocked that she was still alive. It was like saying Huckleberry, or like Samuel Clemens or something. Like this name, everyone in Florida had to read
Yeah.
her book in fourth or fifth grade. And I just assumed she wrote this book like hundreds of years ago, and she was alive. She was like in her 90s. And um, I got to go to her house and interview this, person whose book I read when I was in elementary school. And I was like, I totally got the bug. I was like, this is the coolest job in the world. You get to go into people's houses and talk to them, like, and they let you in. And some of them are like super famous people. Like, why would anyone do any other job? And so I got hooked then.
Very cool. You know what? That's how I kind of feel about podcasting now. Is
Yeah.
you start to read things and you see certain or you read books or see certain news articles, and then I'm like, wow, I wish I could talk to that person. And then, oh, I actually can. And now we have some kind of common ground where I can get their story out or whatever we want to talk about. For you though, like you've traveled the world doing this now and had some pretty epic, I'll say, interviews. And if people go look at like your Wikipedia page, they can see those type of things. So as you're going along, what is it that you're looking for when you're getting into a story? Is it more looking for the experience of something, or is it the opportunity that presents itself? Like, how do you find yourself in these certain parts of the world, talking to these incredible different types of people? What is it that gets you there?
I think as I've matured as a journalist, I've gotten more and more interested in the sort of the underlying issues.
Mm,
I think when you start out, you're like, I just want to meet interesting people and talk to interesting folks and tell interesting stories. And that's obviously an important part of journalism. But getting beyond those stories, getting really understanding why things are happening, how things are happening. I'll give you an example. After the invasion of Iraq, I was sent to Iraq to do a story with Bob Simon, my colleague at 60 Minutes, about the Shiites. Shiites are the majority Muslim sect in Iraq, but they've been historically oppressed by the Baathists, by Saddam Hussein, who was a Baathist, and many of them were slaughtered during the first Gulf War. Um, it was a complicated, the role of the Shiites is complicated. Iran is Shiite, and Iran and Iraq had this long
mm,
war, and there's connections between the Shiites and Iran. It's like there was a lot of lack of I think there's still a lot of lack of understanding, but certainly in 2003, people didn't really understand any of that stuff. I mean, that famous country song. I don't know the difference between Iraq and Iran. Um, and then add then the sort of the religious layers of it. Um, so I went there to tell this thing, but I didn't want to interview a bunch of experts, right? You need a story, you need a character that represents it. And um, I had some colleagues in Baghdad who were saying, this guy Muqtada al-Sadr is like really fascinating. His uncle and his father were both victims of Saddam. He's a young guy, but he's this very sort of fire. They were calling him a firebrand cleric. He would give these very rousing Friday night sermons at the Imam Ali Mosque, which is this huge historic mosque in the holy city of Najaf. And it's kind of like an unknown person, but all of a sudden he'd like with Saddam gone, he had risen overnight in prominence, and was able to get 100,000 people on the street, with sort of a passing
mm.
statement at a sermon. And then I spoke to the U.S. colonel, the Marine colonel in charge of that area, and he was like, "Yeah, this guy's the real deal. Like we have our eye on him. We're very conscious of what he's doing. We're very concerned that he could lead to he could create an insurgency if he wanted to, which is exactly what he did in 2004." Um, and so, we got this interview with him, the first interview with him, and it was an incredible interview. Like it was really kind of his coming out to the world. But being able to capture the nuance of someone like him. And there was this wonderful moment where Bob Simon put the question to him. He was like, because he was very, very against the Americans. He's like, get out
Yeah.
of here. you know, you guys screwed us over. Last time you said you were going to protect us, and you said you guys should, in the first Gulf War, Bush said, the Shiites, you should revolt and overthrow Saddam. We're going to protect you. And so they did. And they were like, great, the Americans are going to send gunships. And so they revolted, and the U.S. were like, "Yeah, we changed our mind," and so they totally let the Shiites get slaughtered. So there was a lot of anger and animosity. And they're like, great, got rid of Saddam, awesome, but now let us run our own country, and you can leave now.
And you're the only Westerners, I think it was, to interview this guy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and well, what was, and so I mean, like the nuance, like he was like, Bob said to him, but isn't the enemy of your enemy your friend? Saddam was your
Mhm.
enemy, and and the Americans got rid of Saddam, so shouldn't the U.S. and you be best buds? And he's like, Saddam was a small Satan. You guys are the big Satan. So just like this really like great little moment that captured the big picture of what was going on. And the at the time, the Bush administration had painted a fairly simplistic picture of like, democracy is going to flower and bloom, and it's going to be awesome, and they're going to welcome us with
Mhm.
open arms. And obviously that didn't happen.
Yeah. So, well, and you know what? I think you bring up a really good point there, because it'll speak to all the things we're going to be talking about today. But the focus on the underlying issues, and you get that nuance in there. And I want to say, I find that missing from a lot of general reporting nowadays. So, if you look at mainstream media, so in Canada, we have CBC, CTV. I guess in the US, it'd be like the big ones like ABC, CBS, so on and so forth.
Mhm.
Um, but it's a lot of like headlines and clickbait, and you don't see necessarily the depth anymore. If I'm using the proper terms, I hope I am. Um, but at least that's the way I feel like when I read a lot of the stuff. And I like to find those journalism pieces, the investigative journalism, because you get that nuance and you get a real feeling for how a person conveys themselves or the message they want to get across to you. Like it incorporates emotion and their character, whereas a lot of the stuff I see nowadays is it's just like it's real flash in the pan, and it's almost like it's just looking for the clicks and the dollars. um Maybe I'm way off base. I mean, the how the stuff works behind the scenes, but where do people go to find that? Like, where do they go, and how do they know it's the truth or some version of the truth, right? Because there's always multiple sides to a story. um but just like, how do you find these things in today's world? It's there's so much clutter.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think part of the thing I think we have to understand is why it is the way it
Mm,
is. Um, Budgets are tighter, public's attention span is
yeah.
shorter. Um, it is. I mean, you use the word clickbait. I think it goes. I think it's not as crass as clickbait, although there's obviously plenty of that as well. But it's people just want to know what's going on. What happened today, right? Was there a fire? Was there? What did Trump do? What did Aliyev do? What did Trudeau do? Like like just sort of the granular stuff, and that there's an important role that journalists play in letting you
Yeah.
know there's whatever there's a roadblock on this highway. Avoid that, from that kind of news you can use information to just like basically this is a meeting that happened in Ottawa today or whatever it might be. There's often not a lot of time for the journalists to even dig into personally
Mm,
understanding what are the underlying issues. And then even if they do personally understand it, and a lot of them do, um, because they report on it for a long time, and they do. I think a lot of journalists care a lot and do a good job. But then you need to find the time in that story, whether it's a broadcast story or find the words in a text story, whatever, to then explain all of that. And there's a fear that you'll lose the audience, and sometimes there's maybe even some evidence that you will lose the audience if you start getting into all sorts of wonky stuff. People just want to know. I think it's interesting with Donald Trump, the risk of getting to that topic. Like 8 years ago, there was a lot of hand wringing in the American media, and I think beyond that as well, but certainly in the American media, which I know the best, that we did a bad job of covering Trump's ascent, and um, gave him a lot of attention for extraordinary things that he would say, or kind of entertaining things.
yeah, all the tweets and everything.
Yeah, but there wasn't a lot of effort to actually go to the heartland and talk to people who were Trump
Yes.
supporters. So I think there was a I think a lot of people in kind of mainstream elite media were shocked when Trump won because the polls said he wasn't going to win, and the people that they talked to, I'm not going to vote for Trump. Well, the people they were talking to were in Manhattan and were in Los Angeles, right? Like they weren't going to Iowa, they weren't going to Nebraska and to Michigan and to Ohio. They weren't going to the Rust Belt and to the South. Um, Partly because there's not the budget, there's time. It takes a long time to fly there. You got to find people, and it's for the most part, it's not the people in the newsroom. The people in the newsroom tend to be coastal elites. They're educated. They're from a different kind of cohort of people, and so they miss that story. But what's interesting is that there was all this introspection that like we're going to do it right next time. 8 years later, they did the same
Yeah.
thing. There wasn't a real connection to the real underlying issues that animated a lot of people to ultimately vote for Trump. Um, and that requires a level of kind of nuanced reporting that I just think oftentimes there's not a lot of time and patience for. So what you're saying, where do they go? They go to podcasts like this. They go to magazine articles. I mean, the content is still
Mhm.
out there. It's not like there's not. You can find really smart, thoughtful analysis. Some of it is partisan. Some of it has a partisan bend. Um, but I think the public has gotten pretty sophisticated in understanding, when they're reading something, when they're listening to something, that where that podcaster is coming from, where that writer is coming from, where that broadcaster is coming from.
Yeah.
And maybe they agree, maybe they don't agree. I mean, my favorite things to listen to are the people I don't agree with, because I learn new perspectives, and even if I disagree with them, I start to understand why they think the way they do.
Yeah, I 100%. One of the things that when I'm looking at news or if I'm watching a podcast or a show, I look at the host and I think, okay, what is this? First of all, it's like who's backing this person, right? Whether it's the sponsors they put on their page, what kind of sourcing do they do for their information that they're giving? But also, it's like, well, what's their motives, right? So they can say a whole bunch of stuff, but what are they showing? What's their track record? One of the things that when you're talking about like, maybe the newsroom or those journalists, they don't have the time or they're missing something. I just wonder, is it just the one side of it, or if we look at things like foreign influence, a lot of talk about that in Canada right now, and obviously with Trump, there's lots of speculation or whether it's true or not. But so there's the foreign influence component, but then there's also, I guess, a third component that might be the dollars and the cents, right? Like we're trying to make some money off of something, so we want to be first to print it, whether it's necessarily true or not, or it's like almost like everyone's okay with playing along certain lines, like in a gray zone where it's like, well, it's true, but it's maybe a little loose. Like, just do all those things kind of come into effect? Have you come across anything like that?
Sorry, can you just articulate the question a little differently? Like what
Yeah.
what specifically are you asking?
So when you were saying that the journalist might not have time, I think that's one aspect, right? Like they're trying to get something to print, but I think that is a small part of why they might not put out a whole story or dig deeper. I think other things that come into effect would be things like the foreign influence, or maybe someone's trying to control a narrative. I guess one line I was thinking about that I heard on another podcast I thought was interesting. It was talking about the difference between allowing unvetted questions versus tightly controlled narratives. So it's like,
Mhm.
well, who gets to ask the questions, and what quality are those questions versus, is the person that's going to give you that answer, are they basically saying like, I'm only going to talk to person A and B, but not C, because I know they're going to ask tough questions. And then even when that gets out, I'm going to have some influence on A to maybe write stuff in a little bit of a more positive light or leave a certain sentence out. So just wonder like how much of that comes into effect. And I would guess it depends on the source, the media source that.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the media. I mean, I will say in my experience, and I've been doing this for more than 30 years, I've never been in a situation in which I feel like I've been manipulated in any way by
Okay.
my bosses,
Yeah.
saying don't tell the story or do tell the story. I think it's much more subtle than that. And part of it is what you just said, which is that, if you do a lot of, I don't want to call it negative coverage, but it's like tough coverage of whatever, maybe a mayor, it doesn't matter, what level of reporting you're doing. If you're doing national reporting, it may be a prime minister or president or, cabinet members. On a local level, it may be the police chief or whatever it might be.
Hmm.
If you do tough reporting, and then there are other reporters who aren't doing tough reporting, if the police chief ultimately has to make a decision who they're going to do an interview with, there's they I mean, I'd love to think that some of them would say, actually, I want to do the interview with someone who's really asking tough questions because I'm going
Yeah.
to prove, I want to be challenged. I want to be able to show that we're doing a great job, whatever. But so often, obviously, people take the path of least resistance and the safest route, and that's talking to the friendly sources. So there's kind of a feedback loop there, which says
Yeah. That's a good way to
too
put it.
tough, you're not going to have access, or you might jeopardize access. So maybe you should be a little nicer. There is definitely that happening in media in all levels, no question about it. And some of it is very subtle, and some of it is probably unconscious. I don't think
Mm.
journalists don't get into this business because they want to, kiss the ass of politicians or whoever. Like they want to do good work, but a lot of it is unconscious, I think. Like, maybe I need to like pull back a little bit on this because it might hurt my relationship with this source or whatever it might be. And frankly, the other part of it is that people in the spotlight, whether they're CEOs or politicians or whatever, have gotten extremely sophisticated. When I started out, there was almost a naivete to people being interviewed, and they would be like blindsided by these questions sometimes, and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you asked
Hmm.
that question. Now they are like highly trained athletes, ready for every eventuality. Like they have media training. They do certainly for high profile interviews, they'll do rehearsals and run through all the anticipated questions that might be asked, and
Yeah.
and and also people are trained to control the narrative. So you might ask me a question about whatever. You might ask me a tough question about a story I did, and I could just ignore that answer and just draw you to an awesome story I did.
It's
And I
like a
mean,
political speak.
right, exactly. And that's politicians do that, but now everybody does that.
Hmm.
Even just average people on the street have sort of learned how to do that, of controlling the narrative. Don't let the interviewer control it. The interviewee should control it. You should be in charge of your own narrative, and don't let them push you around. So that makes it very difficult because eventually, if I keep ignoring your questions, eventually you're going to get flustered, and then you're going to kind of look like a jerk because you're browbeating me, right? So it makes it tough for the journalist and the interviewer because if they really hold their feet to the fire, eventually it just becomes very uncomfortable.
Hmm. And I'll say my own experience with doing this podcast, and as I was saying just before we kind of started recording, I've had guests on here all the way from the municipal side of politics right through the federal level, but it's only from the conservative side. And what I found interesting about it is every time I put out an invite, if it's like the liberal or NDP side, they just don't even respond, just
Mm,
ghosted. And then the conservative side, I've had some people just say no thanks, which is cool. Like, hey, yeah, you don't got time or whatever. I know. But the ones that have said yes, they've never said, hey, I want a list of questions or nothing, which was kind of surprising to me. I thought all politicians would be like that. But
mhm.
all their chiefs of staff and some of the communications people I've talked with, they've all just said like, "Hey, just like shoot me a list of like the couple topics we're going to talk about, just so we
Right.
have an idea. We can come in with some numbers in mind or whatever you're going to talk about." But they've never vetted any questions or anything, which is what I totally expected. So I've been surprised by some things and also not surprised by other things. I expected to get it ghosted in some ways, but yeah, I didn't expect it to be so like divided. Like one side 100% won't talk to I guess a police
Right.
officer on a police podcast. So Um, but now that you're a professor, how do you explain to students like staying true to the outcome? Like, so if they're trying to investigate a specific topic, and they're just trying to get all the information out there, how do you get that? How do you get them to avoid that kind of influence? Maybe whether it's subtle or it's like a very overt thing, and just kind of push through and put something out that they're satisfied with. And I guess also in that, how do you choose what you're cutting or putting out there?
I mean, there's kind of two different questions there. I'll take the easy one first, and I mean, what you're
Yeah.
cutting. I mean, you obviously experienced that. You have a broadcast outlet platform, so you're going to make choices. You're going to cut out ums, cut out when I walk my dog. Let my dog out. All those things. And then you might have to just make some decisions. This ran long. I need to take some things out. Hopefully, you're making those decisions in a thoughtful way, in an ethical way, and I think that's one of the things that we do a lot of time, spend a lot of time training people. You saw the whole controversy at 60 Minutes with Vice President Harris, and the interview that was done there that
Yeah.
Donald said was like taken out of context and proof that the liberal media was trying to make her look good and edit things around. The full transcript has come out. The full tape has come out. I think people would be hard pressed to have any evidence that happened. Um, but what happened was simply making editorial decisions.
Yeah.
For this length and this audience, this is what's interesting, and for this length and this audience, this is what's interesting. At 60 Minutes, there is a full-time person who does nothing but, I say nothing but like one of their main jobs is to look at the transcript and make sure that you're not taking an answer from one place and marrying it with a question from another place. And
Okay.
sometimes you might do that intentionally. Someone might do that intentionally, but oftentimes they might just do that by mistake because oh, this is a really great question and this is a really great answer, and it kind of goes together. That is 100% forbidden. I mean, they are so strict about that.
Okay.
Uh, they look at the transcript with time code, and they're really, really now, but that answer might be 3 minutes long, and you may not put a 3 minute long answer. So you might choose an element of an answer. So those are editorial judgments that you have to make. And if we train people, and I think at major networks and news organizations, we have editorial guidelines and editors that check all this stuff. I think the bigger challenge that I think we have in general in the in the emerging media landscape. And so I'm you asked me about students, and they are the emerging media landscape, right?
Yeah.
They're the future journalists, and the emerging journalists. Is I think there's less and less interest in what I was sort of raised in, this notion of quote unquote objective journalism. So, and I think for a couple of reasons. One is that people are, I think, more politically motivated from whatever angle, whether on the left, right, or wherever they are. Um, People have like these convictions, and they want to report stories that sort of reaffirm their convictions. Um,
Yeah.
so that's one issue, and the other issue is that, and I think this is a reasonable critique, which is that I think a lot of journalists, young journalists, and I think even a lot of people in the public have come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as objectivity, right? Like this is not the word of God coming down. I mean, we all have biases. We all have perspectives. They may leak into our reporting, unintentionally, intentionally, whatever. And there's been a lot of academic work on this notion of like what was considered objective when I was coming up as a journalist was objective, quote unquote, objective for a very specific audience, the people who were running the newsrooms that I was in, which are
Mm.
mostly middle-aged white guys. So it was like the middle-aged white guy's perspective that was the objective perspective. And so people from other, and mostly kind of a left-leaning middle-aged white guy. So, everybody else who didn't fit that, you know, the editor's own personal biases
Yeah.
fell off of the norm of quote unquote objectivity.
But would they then think that you are basically you're not asking the tough question, or you're not going after the person enough in a way that I think you should because you have a different objectivity?
Yeah, I think it's more just like, if this there was this effort to achieve this fictional objectivity
Okay.
of like not having any bias, and we're reporting it purely fact based. But you're always making editorial decisions. You have a lot of fact. I mean, you just said it, right. You have a long interview. You're making the choice of what you're going to put. You have a bunch of details, bunch of facts, and you're going to make a decision of what you're ultimately going to put into your story. And so subtly, the in the good faith effort to be objective, you are still being subjective, but you're just being subjective for the majority power, within the newsroom at
Mhm.
any given time. So I think this is a very long way of saying, I think a lot of people have come to question this whole very notion of objectivity. And so I think a lot of people have come to question the very notion of objectivity, and have embraced this notion of transparency, and say, this is my political perspective. This is my background. This is my, race, my religion, my whatever, my gender identity. Like, being putting all that stuff out there. You never knew any of that stuff. I mean,
Mhm.
there were entire broadcasters who, for years, like John Hockenberry. I mean, I used to listen to John Hockenberry for many, many years on the radio. Like, it was decades later that I found out he was in a wheelchair. He didn't make that part of his story. He, you know, he was just this voice. I didn't know what I don't know anything about him. Like, and that was kind of the way it used to be. Now people, there would not be a journalist in the wheelchair today who wouldn't make that part of their narrative in some way. And I think that's a good thing in a way, because it allows the public to kind of know where the person's coming from,
Okay.
and then can kind of consume that news or that opinion or whatever it is with a bit of knowledge. I mean, we did that in our personal lives. Like, you don't have any objective friends, I would guess. I don't have any objective friends. When I meet a friend, whether it's a friend from high school or a colleague or,
Yeah.
whatever, I know I have maybe I don't know where they're coming from, but I think I know where they're coming from in most cases, right? So if they say something, if my liberal friend says something positive about Donald Trump, that's going to really resonate in a different way than if a conservative friend says something about Donald Trump.
Yeah.
And so that, we do that in our personal lives in a very sort of subtle, unconscious kind of way. I think there's value in doing that in the public sphere as well.
Okay. When you're saying like you're choosing what to kind of cut and edit or what's going to be included in something, I'm wondering too, like when you are developing that final product, whose story or how do you know whose story you're ultimately telling then? Like is it what you as the news person want to get across so you can selectively pick out what, your guest was saying that fits your narrative? Or are you there to serve in a way that's like, okay, this person's here talking about these things and I want to get their full story, their full version. So, if they say the same thing in five different sentences, I only need one of those sentences. I'm just going to take the one for time's sake. But am I getting what I want or am I giving what they want? Is kind of my question. Like, which side of it are we trying to get across to the public? And I think sometimes it becomes about the news agency more than what that person, what their guest was actually trying to say.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's a third element in this equation, in this relationship, and it's the public. And I would say
Hmm.
our number one duty is to the public. It's not to your news agency and their agenda. It's not to the interview subject, who almost always has some agenda. Sometimes they have a very clear, overt agenda with a politician or whatever, and sometimes or an NGO or whatever. Sometimes it's just, they're more man on the street kind of interview. But I think you need to be true to the public and say, how am I serving the public best? So this person has come to do this interview. They have a clear agenda. They're pushing a certain narrative. I need to hold them accountable. I need to be clear to the public what that person's agenda is and why they're sitting down with me. Um, and I think if you do all that well, then you're serving the public. That's the most important thing. And
Mhm.
if you personally or your news organization has an agenda, um, just be really clear about that. If I'm going to go on Fox News, I mean, I as an interview subject know what to expect at Fox News,
Yeah.
and you as a listener or viewer in the public know what to expect at Fox News. And so, as long as everything's on the table, Fox News, MSNBC, whatever, like it's doesn't doesn't matter what the news organization is, as long
Yeah.
as they're clear about what their perspective and agenda is.
So I guess that kind of leads me to the thought about labels. And when you hear like fake news, I think Trump made that kind of famous, that whole term. But you see now with CBC, like Sam Cooper just put out an interesting article today, just talking about how they were maybe being soft on certain narratives around safe supply, so-called safe supply. And it's like, so now news agencies are really getting questioned about their own product when they're the ones who are supposed to be questioning uh, everybody else out there. So it's like, how do we know how to trust certain media stuff? I'm just wondering about the labels that come across, the fake news. What would you say about some of that? What's your take on the fake news idea and how news agencies are getting questioned now? Is that kind of their own self doing? Is that just certain politicians pushing that certain label, and it's not true? Like, where do you fall in that kind of, or maybe what's your opinion? I shouldn't say where you fall on that, but what's your opinion around that? Is it self inflicted?
Well, look, I mean, when it comes to fake news, the term fake news, it was brilliantly co-opted by Donald Trump. It was originally a term by critics of Trump and his sort of circle, who were pushing fake stories, like actual false stories, right?
Okay.
So it was it they've now taken this term that was used as a weapon against them, saying they're propagating these fake stories. um and he was like, I mean, it's like kindergartners, like, no, you're a poopy head, I'm not a poopy
Yeah.
head, I'm rubber and you're glue, whatever you say, bounces off of me and sticks to you. Like, so he was like, no, we don't do fake news, in fact, you guys are the fake news, everything you say is fake, and it's agenda driven and all that. And he'll call MSNBC MSDNC for the Democratic National Committee. Like, so I think that politicians in particular have pushed this, very cleverly, this notion that the people who are, I mean, the journalists are supposed to be the fourth estate. They're supposed to hold the other three branches of government accountable. And what better way to sort of get what you want done, than undermining the the folks who are supposed to be keeping you honest, right?
Yeah.
So if the media is really the only thing left that's kind of keeping politicians straight, and then their credibility has been undermined, then you could do whatever you want. And so it's been a very, very clever way of advancing political agendas and undermining those who are going to scrutinize them. That said, going to what you're talking about, like, are there hidden agendas? I mean, I don't think, I really don't think for the most part there are like overt hidden agendas in mainstream media, and I'd consider CBC relatively mainstream. There may be unconscious biases
Mm.
in there that seep in, and again, you make decisions, you make choices on what you're going to report. I mean, we saw this with COVID, where there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of concern, there was public health concerns. Um, some information about COVID was largely kind of hidden from the public, with kind of this notion of like, we're all in this together, and it wasn't a political agenda. It was just more like, we have a potential serious health crisis, and we all need to kind of row in the same direction. And if we're all rowing in different directions, and we're talking about the China lab leak, and masks are useful or not useful, and like, it's going to confuse the public. Should
Yeah.
you get vaccinated? Should you not get vaccinated? So there was a sort of sense of like, we have a duty to report in one direction. I'll take it even further. I'll say, after 9/11, as an American, my family was in the 9/11 attack and they survived, but like it was a very visceral. I lived in New York City. I watched the second plane hit the towers. It was a real thing for me. And many people in media, mainstream media, were in New York, right? So as the war on terror rolled out, I think that there was in a lot of media this sense of kind of surprising patriotism, which kind of hadn't really been there before.
Yeah.
There was this kind of hiding away the human rights abuses that were happening, the roundups of Muslims, the torture. Like there was the invasion of Iraq. I mean, there was this almost kind of like this group psychosis that we had in America of like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
we should have Iraq. Like, and in hindsight, everybody was like, no, of course we shouldn't. I mean, that maybe we shouldn't invade Iraq, but that's a different issue. Like, it was not
Mhm.
because of 9/11. There was no connection between 9/11 and Iraq, but somehow we had this like kind of group hallucination that this was like a good idea because of the experiences of those of Americans.
Yeah, it's one of the I guess things that I've seen that people say is like the last time that America was truly united on all fronts, left or right, doesn't matter, like whatever the spectrum is. That was kind of the last great narrative that united everybody. Just because we're coming up to the end of our time here, so I want to be respectful of your time. One other question I did want to ask is, especially with me coming from a law enforcement background, you're in the journalism side. What's it been like working with government agencies, law enforcement, intelligence? I imagine most of them don't share openly, but is what's your experience been like working with them? And then is there room or ability for law enforcement and journalists to like one day work together um, without any kind of fear of prejudice or losing your job? So, what's it been like for you?
I mean, I'll say I love working with law enforcement. I mean, I've worked very closely with FBI, ATF, CSIS, CIA, MI6. Like I have had incredible sources and experiences with people in all sorts of levels of both law enforcement and intelligence. I mean, most of those people could get much better paying jobs doing other kinds of work, and they're choosing to do this kind of work because they believe in it. And I absolutely love almost in every experience I've had. Um, I mean, obviously, we have situations where we then scrutinize, wrongful activities, but even then, I find for the most part, because usually there's mostly good people in those agencies, and they're like, we don't want to be associated with people who are, choking black men to death on police forces. Like that's not an image we want, right? So
Hmm.
they often will kind of be open about that. Um, I'll tell you a quick little story about this. I just have at the risk of plugging my latest project, it's a film
Yeah.
called BRIBE Inc. So BRIBE Inc. is a long-term investigation about a huge bribery scandal out of Monaco, and my partner on that is this younger. He's not young himself anymore, but he's younger than me. He's kind of a generation below me. Australian reporter named Nick McKenzie.
Yeah.
And in the interest of time, and maybe to whet people's appetite to see the film eventually, I'll make it really short. But basically, the long and short of it is that a whistleblower reached out to Nick with this incredible, like, put an ad in the newspaper Le Figaro in France, and then meet me next to this stand next to the Louvre. Like it was like all very cloak and dagger. And so Nick met this guy, and this guy gave him 300 something thousand pages of internal documents that proved um, widespread bribery by this company, involving some of the biggest companies in the world, involving some of the most powerful political figures in the Middle East, Central Asia, North Africa.
The Una oil, right?
Oil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Nick had this incredible story, and he did something that I honestly, and I will confess right here, I wouldn't have thought of doing, and I would have felt very uncomfortable if a colleague had suggested it. But he did it before I was working with him. He realized that the minute he publishes his story, all the evidence that incriminates these guys will be destroyed.
Yeah.
So it'll just be hearsay, could be faked leaked documents, whatever.
Fire up the shredders.
Shredders, the laptop,
Yeah.
laptops will be
Spilling
crushed and
water
burned.
on laptops. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you need to do more than that. Um, so what he did is he went to the Serious Fraud Office, which in the UK, and these guys were British citizens. He went to the Serious Fraud Office and went to the prosecutor, Tom Martin, there, and said, "Listen, in a week's time, I'm going to publish a story. Here's all the evidence. If you guys want to nab these guys, you should do it before my story publishes because, you know, they're
Yeah.
going to destroy everything." And so, to his credit, the British prosecutor took it seriously, and he put a task force together, and they went to Monaco. They made a deal with the Monegasque police, and they raided the offices. They took all the hard drives. I mean, they got all the evidence, which was allowed them to build this incredible case. And it was because the journalist gave them a tip beforehand.
Mhm.
That is something I was raised not to do. We don't
Yeah.
work in partnership. Like, we can have a very friendly relationship with law enforcement. We can have them as sources. Even if they obviously, if law enforcement is looking for a suspect, we can put that information out as a public good. There's all sorts of ways that we can work with law enforcement, but to essentially bring them into the newsroom as partners with us is kind of something you don't typically do. But Nick did it, and I mean, in the end, it was a win-win for everyone, because except for bad guys, because I don't think there was any blowback on Nick and the journalists for having tipped off the police, or the authorities. The authorities were able to build this case. I mean, the case fell apart longer term, but it had nothing to do with the origin. So justice was served, at least at the beginning, and the journalism wasn't harmed in any way. I don't think the
Mhm.
journalism was harmed. It's not like it's one thing if law enforcement had come and said, and I've been in the situation where law enforcement has said, "Do not publish this information."
Mhm.
That would damage our case. That's a more difficult scenario. But I think even
Yeah.
there, you need to, again. I mean, I will say, I had evidence after 9/11. I know I'm dating myself here, but after 9/11, I did a story about a train derailment in Europe, um, and and then we started looking at train safety in America. And I had evidence that the New York subway system was vulnerable, like highly, highly vulnerable to being flooded. So basically, you just have to put a one one bomb in a subway that goes under the East River to
Mhm.
Brooklyn, and the subway system is all connected, right? Like,
Yeah.
every single subway is connected in some way, and it's underground. And the East River has a lot of water. So you blow up one tunnel, that tunnel gets filled, and the entire subway system, with like 2.5, 3 million people at rush hour, gets flooded, and every single person drowns.
Wow.
So, like, what I have this incredible information, but if I publish that, one, I'll cause a massive panic. Nobody will ever get on a subway again.
Yeah.
Two, law enforcement is now letting bad guys know that there's this vulnerability. Hey, here's a great idea. Al Qaeda, why don't you blow up the A train? So, for the sake of the public good, I didn't publish that information. And so, and when you do things like that, I think it's fundamentally the right thing to do, but it also earns trust with law enforcement. That's like, look, this guy's not just out for like the quick headline. Like,
Mhm.
he understands that there's a bigger issue here. And I think compromises like that are perfectly reasonable and should be done.
Yeah, and this kind of I'm glad that you mentioned Bribe Incorporated, because that was the last thing I was going to try and touch on. So I've had Nick McKenzie on this show. Actually, I did a whole series on China foreign influence, and he was one of the guests. So him and Sam Cooper were two of the five guests that I had on. But just going back to the working with law enforcement, I mean, I find that stuff super fascinating. I think law enforcement can't do it all by themselves, and there needs to be way more relationship building with private sector. There needs to be more relationship building with journalists and media, because they're allowed to go and do and ask things that, as an authority figure, I'm not allowed to do, or at least not in the capacity that they do it, right? If I want to ask someone investigative questions, I'm probably reading them their rights beforehand or cautioning them in Canada, whatever it's called in the US. So,
Mhm.
I have to be more careful around those types of things, and then it might not be evidence. But, when I read good article like Sam puts stuff out, or I even see stuff in the local news, and it's like, hey, these different characters got charged in this big fraud ring. Well, I want to know who those people are. Like, I've never heard of them. So now
Right.
I'm going out and looking into things and being like, oh, look, and now I've tied these people into this bigger organization. So media is helping in a lot of ways, and I think it's just, if we could leverage each other more and have those relationships, that would be critical. We would be able to solve so many more things, or at the very least gather a lot more intelligence. So we're just coming up to the end of our time here. I just want to, the last thing I always do is give people the opportunity to say where people can find you and your work. We mentioned Bribe Incorporated. I'll put the links up to that. I hope it hits theaters where I can watch it.
Yeah, good
And
enough.
but what else? Where can people find you and your work?
The Global Reporting Center has a globalreportingcenter.org, both the Canadian and the American spelling works. Has some of the work that we're doing out of that center, and I have a Twitter, all that stuff. Peter W. Klein. That's kind of my brand. So in most places, I'm at Peter W. Klein, Klein. Um, yeah. So thank you. I appreciate your this conversation.
Yeah, I know. I appreciate having you on here. Hang on line for 1 second. We'll chat real quick offline.
Okay.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.